For today's lesson, let's place ourselves in a historical time of war, in a Vienna of secession and artistic renewal. Social, political, and economic problems plague Austria, which is experiencing, however, its time of greatest creative splendor, especially its capital. To get into the context around the birth of Egon Schiele, around the time he is born, Pasteur discovers the vaccine against rabies and Röntgen the X-rays. Diesel invents his engine. The Lumiere brothers present the cinematograph, and the first edition of the Nobel Prizes is celebrated. The list of relevant characters in culture and the arts is almost endless, and in previous lessons we have already seen some of them. At Klimt, Chagall, Picasso, Klimt, Monet, Braque, Mondrian, among many others. Egon Schiele was born on June 12, 1890, in Tulln, a small town about 45 kilometers northwest of Vienna. Orphaned by 15, he was sent to live with his uncle, who luckily was very supportive of his artistic pursuit. He was always artistically gifted, and by the time he was in high school, he was encouraged by his art teacher to apply to study at the Vienna Academy of Art, and he was accepted immediately. Just as would happen to Picasso, the bone dry academy style of the lessons bored him, although it gave him a solid technical grounding. Schiele, scandalous and eccentric from the beginning, knew and supported the motto of the secession: to each time its art, to each art its freedom. And he considered that the academy and traditional art went against this philosophy. After a defiant departure from the conservative Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, which had nevertheless introduced the young artist to life drawing, he formed, with some other former students, the New Art Group. The credo of this group of artists was formulated by Schiele himself. The new artist is and must necessarily be himself, a creator who must forsake the use of the historical and the time honored, building anew from scratch, a declaration of war on the traditional academic teaching methods. Egon Schille's entry into the lively Vienna art scene before the First World War led quickly to success, with his artistic talent being widely recognized. His role model was the then already successful Gustav Klimt, whose recently finished work The Keys had been shown in 1908 and immediately purchased by the Ministry of Culture and Education. Thanks to him, the just 19-year-old Schiele was able to exhibit four works in the prestigious International Art Exhibition of 1909, alongside Henri Matisse, Pierre Bonnard, and many others. Klimt held him in high regard, introducing him to some wealthy patrons who assured him a certain financial stability, especially as a newcomer on the Viennese art scene, and in response, Schiele adopted some of his creative principles, such as accentuating the drawing with thick lines, especially when representing the naked body. In the summer of 1906, even before entering the academy, we already see his early talent in a series of notebooks that reveal his first landscapes and self portraits, as well as letters and notes sent to his adolescent loves. They are works still very far from the nudes that would make him famous, with a still romantic and naturalistic sense. But as he himself would say a few years later at the Second Universal Exhibition, no sector of life is so meager and insignificant that do not offer space for artistic aspirations. Klimt had his career well in hand when Schiele approached him to trade drawings sometime around 1907. The art student offered several sheets for one of the masters, but Klimt saw the raw potential and power of the young man's work and replied, "Why do you want to exchange with me? You draw better than I do." With several sales and commissions, 1909 would mark the beginning of a successful art career, starting mostly with radical portraits. His disturbing figure paintings reflected emotional states such as anxiety, loneliness, or distress, reacting to the social tensions which electrified Vienna before the outbreak of war. As we saw in the last lesson, Klimt's exuberant ornamentation talked of soft desire and ecstasy, while Schiele mixed this with stronger emotions and more aggressive lines. Schille's earliest works, inspired by the Art Nouveau style, were also references to the themes and compositions used by Klimt, but with greater emotional tension, with a sensuality that frequently turned into an erotic obsession. By 1910, after having separated from the new art group due to its failed exhibitions and poor success, he finally decided to work on a more personal style and concluded a letter to a friend with the phrase, "Until March, I have passed through Klimt. Today, I think I am a completely different person." The human body has been studied, of course, all through art history, but it is at the turn of the century that artists start representing it as an object, as mass in space. Left up, we see Picasso, more interested in the drawing itself than the women, doing it with a confident, unique line. Clint, much more reserved in pencil than in his usual techniques, draws and redraws almost in discomfort, as if seeing something he shouldn't, with a woman draped in sheets and hiding from our view. Sheila's women, in contrast, are as violently objectified as possible. Young as he was, surrounded by already world famous artists such as Klimt and Picasso, he is the most comfortable with the linear representation and the sheer physicality of the female nude. At the center of Egon Schiele's work is a study of the human being, the uncovering of their uncontrollable impulses and desires. He often truncates or omits fingers, feet, and faces, or as in this case, whole bodies. We see a hint of Klint's poses, but Schiele made a point of rejecting the more decorative aspect of Klint's style, even using as a material a decaying type of paper that would leave that particular pale brown and that would not withstand its exposure to light. In his work, any hint of chiaroscuro is absent, and light is conceived exclusively as color. The way of conceiving forms and colors differs greatly from the drawing tradition he had to follow during the years of the Academy. Now, the overall posture is recognizable, true to life and proportion, but also heavily stylized. Sometimes he outlined the bodies with a white border, as if they were surrounded by an aura. For Schiele, bodies emanated light, and as he said, "I draw the light that comes from the bodies." He was boss of human representation, yes, but inspired by Vincent van Gogh's observation of nature, Schiele also manages to create a collection of nature studies of a simple elegance, although he would feel them empty of content. In one of his writings, he would say, "I also do studies, but I believe and know that copying nature is not important to me, because I paint better from memories as a vision of the landscape. Now I mainly observe the bodily movements of the mountains, the water, the trees, and the flowers. Everywhere they remind me of movements similar to those of the human body, similar feelings of joy and sorrow in plants." Just as he represents nature, he also observes urban landscapes, traditional in his youth and becoming less descriptive and more imaginative representations over time. He focused on the constructions of the houses, many of them from a bird's eye view, and although he made many sketches of the style, he would always say that the city did not produce any emotion. Later, Schiller's landscapes will gradually move away from simple reproduction to become those emotional landscapes at the end of his life. The figures, especially those where he represents himself, are radical and aggressive. He is and feels exposed, as if he wanted to consciously uncover the body and the soul. The bodies seem angular, bony, brutally fragmented and trimmed, trapped in bizarre contortions or spasmodic tension. Self portraiture as a genre had flourished during the modern period, and the way he chose to represent faces and bodies, especially his own, resonates with his interest in psychiatry and the study of mental illness in Vienna of his time, the time of Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis, the unlocking of the subconscious, and the loss of identity. The physical nudity of his models, which included many young girls and women, corresponds to their exposed emotional vulnerability. With a strong line, Schiele outlined the figures, which are mostly positioned without any hint of a spatial context, at our mercy. Freud's book on sexuality and psychopathology opened new windows into the mind. Both Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele appear to have seen the body as a bridge to the psyche, a transparent envelope through which we can read desire, in Klimt's case, and trauma, in Schiele's. Jane Kaller, curator and author of one of the most important Schiele's monograph, comments Schiele was not a pervert or a pornographer, but his way of seeing sexuality as an eros free from the conditions imposed by society could have made the intolerant and limited society generate censorship on his works. So, in the next few works, we will see about that. And he was bound to generate censorship when many of his works were as controversial as the one we see here. In The Cardinal and the Nun, we see probably Schiller's most provocative pictorial content, with the violation of clerical moral codes in this scandalous embrace. This work is testament to Egon Schille's impetus urged for renewal, in which he radically breaks with traditions even beyond formal issues of art, and spreads a message of social criticism against the falsehood of the bourgeoisie and other official institutions. With this eroticism, he, as a subject, is always in conflict and frontal confrontation with any image of authority, also achieving a breaking point with a European tradition rarely seen before, that unusual art in which the artist sacrifices beauty in favor of expression. Much of our artist's inspiration would come from many years ago, from El Greco, the Greek, and his expressionist art of elongated figures and melodramatic gestures, with an unusual spatial treatment to match those suffering subjects. From him, Schiele would learn to represent uneasy, grotesque, grimacing faces, exalted gestures, and long limbs. Like the Greek, he is inspired by a certain religiosity, although he himself is not a believer. He believed, yes, that every artist is close to being a monk or a priest, a spiritually enlightened being with the mission of sharing his vision with the less privileged masses. Finally, the Greek's figures are reminiscent of dancing bodies, in motion, a theme and style that would always fascinate Schiele. And talking about movement, let's meet one of his best friends. The dancer Muhammadu was an icon of turn of the century Viennese culture, just as Schiele himself, and with him she shared a fascination with forms of bodily expression as well as with the extreme distortion of facial expressions and gestures. Although he was primarily a linear artist, here the artist works in wash with a rather architectural combination of colors. In Moa, finally, the intense but suppressed emotions of the Viennese society had found their external form. Sheila found Moa and her actual life partner Erwin Orsen entrancing, and he admired their sense of life as a performance. It is so interesting to see an artist's style developing to its fullest, and in Schill's case, most of the vocabulary of movement that we see in most of his later works, many of them self-portraits, he picked from this extravagant couple. Orson, also a mime and scenographer, would become his friend and model, a friend from whom he would also study the dramatic and artificial expressions, convulsive movement, and the passion for the strange. In that strangeness, Orson would also show Sheila the world of the psychologically disturbed, showing him sketches and taking him to draw the patients at the Steinhoff Mental Hospital. This also reminds me of the lesson on Diane Arbus, which I recommend if you haven't seen it. These gestures and radical forms of the body would never again go unnoticed in his art, like in these couples entwined in a loveless erotic embrace. Employing colors in red, dark brown, pale yellow, and gloomy blacks, he tried to paint the pathos finding melancholy even in his scenes of supposed intimacy. This collection is characterized by a nervous line, almost neurotic, eyes that are represented as mere dots, simplified and without depth, with a hint of sadness and regret. Seeking to show the deepest repressed instincts, Sheila experiments with exhibitionism and voyeurism and does not allow the space for decoration or superfluous information. For this reason, almost none of his figures are surrounded by a background or a landscape, and the models stare intensely at us. His work always had a theoretical foundation that was based on the idea of the total work of art, an art that was not limited to the formal, but also to the spiritual representation of the model. This was the reason for his aggressive figurative distortions, a technique to show the whole person, the body in pose, but also as a state of mind. In Sheila, there is a game between concealment and revelation, where the body is on many occasions no more than an ornament. Schiele, like Klimt, loved women. However, his primary subject and greatest interest was himself. He was a narcissist and obsessed with his own visceral experience of life. But through his erotic art, Egon sought to unfold the truth of the individual, a deeper meaning, the existential hardship and deep loneliness linked to the expressionism of his generation. He used the human form to express raw emotions, often through physical distortion, but his style was not always well received, as he lived in a rather conservative and reactionary society influenced by bourgeois ideas. Thus, most of the sketches hanging in his apartment would be considered scandalous and conflicting, even when many recognized his talent and collected his art. Schiele met American dancer Ruth Sandeny in Vienna during her European tour in August 1907, where she achieved great success with her modern choreographies inspired by Buddhism and Theosophy. Our artist admired her artistic style influenced by Greek and Indian elements. Again, in his work, he returns to the concept of movement, distortion, and body strength. Giving context to these times, the sculptor Auguste Rodin, who we recognized the past lesson as a friend of Gustav Klimt too, also made some drawings of Saint Denis when her tour passed through Paris. Thus, we see how the stories of the artists that we sometimes study as independent entities intertwine, and that we now know were mutual influences and built the culture of the 20th century in Europe. Although the female figure was less important to him than to Klimt, he constantly shows strong, proud, and self confident women, portraits of a deep psychological analysis when drawing them. One of his most important patrons and collectors, Heinrich Benesch, would say, his drawing was something unique. The security of his hand was almost infallible. When he drew, he used to sit on a low stool, the drawing board with the sheets on his knees, resting his right hand on the base. Then he would arrange the pencil, freehand, perpendicular to the sheet, and draw his lines. After he had achieved success, Schiller suddenly felt the urge to leave the Austrian capital. He wrote, I want to get away from Vienna very soon. How ugly it is here. Everyone is deceitful and jealous of me. Former colleagues now look strangely at me. I have to see something new, and I want to investigate it. I want to taste the dark waters and trees that break. I want to see wild winds. He withdrew to Krumlov with the purpose of getting inspiration from a more natural environment, this time accompanied by his model, lover, and partner, Walburga, also known as Wally Nussel. Their relationship as an unmarried couple living together and the controversial style of the artist was met with disapproval in the small town, so they moved immediately, now to Nuremberg. The delicate portrait of his lover Wally with a plant motif was confiscated as a stolen work in 1998 after being exhibited at the MoMA, as it had previously been stolen from a gallery in 1938. After an amicable agreement, the painting returned in 2010 to the Austrian Museum. It was precisely the age of his young partner, who was 17 when they began to live together, among other suspicions, that caused him to be accused of corruption of minors in 1912. And this is not a small thing. Schiele had a habit of having as models the children who came to his house, many of them orphans or from very humble origins, often portraying them naked or in obscene positions. It was in that second town, Nuremberg, that Schiele was arrested on April 1912 after being accused of abducting and abusing a 14-year-old girl. After 3 weeks of detention, the two main charges were dropped, although the child had actually spent several days in Schiele's house without her parents' knowledge. His Viennese patron, Karl Reininghaus, provided him with a lawyer, and Wally supported him fully as she believed in his innocence. Because of the diffusion of his immoral drawings of nude child models, which was considered pornographic, one of his works was burnt in trial, and the artist was finally sentenced to 3 days in prison for diffusing obscene drawings. Many of the drawings of this time and style have that sense of possession over the body of the other, with a vision without limits that will condemn it as censored art in many circles and museums even today. During his time in prison, which Schiele found both humiliating and frightening, the artist produced an impressive series of drawings. After his release, Schiele went traveling before moving with Wally into a new studio apartment in Vienna in the fall of 1912. With the help again of Gustav Klimt and with numerous exhibitions at his arrival to the city, Schiele demonstrated that the scandal had not diminished his artistic success. Nevertheless, Schiele presented himself over the following years in his self portraits as a sufferer or a fighter, or as a self sacrificing Saint Sebastian, showing himself as the victim of his own story. From that moment on, his style would have this indissoluble signature, with a radically flat approach that would not be seen again until the 1940s. He was practically forgotten in the 1930s until the Nazi regime included him among the authors of the degenerate art that we saw in one of the previous lessons. He was then rediscovered to become a fundamental figure in contemporary art. On June 1914, Egon married Edith Harms, who he had met the previous year. In contrast to Wally, who was an illegitimate child of humble origins, Edith was from a middle class family. He wrote to a friend, I plan to marry, favorably, maybe not with Wally, admitting openly that in considering marriage, he was also thinking of his social and financial standing. Shortly after his wedding, Schiele enlisted in the army and was initially stationed in Prague, but then returned to Vienna and was spared from fighting in the front line as he was considered a part of the country's intellectual elite. And so he was given solely administrative chores. As one of the lucky ones, he was able to continue with his artistic work and represent the hardships others were going through. Just as Klimt and Munch would, and influenced by that aura of fear and uncertainty that emanated from war, Schiller strove to recognize life's ambivalence between erotic love and death. The presence in his work of the existential anguish that the human being suffers is constant. That conflict that he illustrates with fragile figures and dark colors. After his separation from Wally Nussel, a 1915 double portrait by Schiller shows his lover in the arms of a personification of death, bearing the likeness of the artist. This may be seen as a desperate embrace, a final farewell from Wally, who would eventually die in 1917 at age 23 of scarlet fever. Egon Schille's self-portraits have often been regarded as the works of a tortured, introspective artist, although they were more of an experimentation of expressive gestures, highly studied and posed. Desperately passionate, Schiele pushed the boundaries on how the human figure is depicted. He made about 100 self-portraits, being one of the painters of the time who most analyzed his own self, exalting his ego, especially in moments of greatest difficulty. From 1910 onwards, he deformed his figure with extravagant poses and pathetic gestures, which consciously made him look old or sick. He showed himself extremely thin, with a contorted body, unruly hair, and almost theatrical postures. Depending on his state of mind, his self portraits become more naturalistic and humane or harsher and sharper. He didn't stop his artistic production even when death felt near. This last sad and premonitory work shows him as a family with his wife and unborn child, The image is of an unusual realism in him, less aggressive and with easily recognizable characters, but it shows a reality that would not be. His wife Edith, pregnant with their first child, died on October 28, 1918, at the age of 25. Just 3 days later, with just 28, he fell to the Spanish flu too, which claimed more victims than the recently ended First World War. During the brief period between their deaths, Schiele made sketches of Edith, which are considered his last works, marked by an agonizing loneliness. Defender above all of the artist's individuality, today Schiele is regarded as one of the greatest artists of the 20th century, who captured the turmoil of his time in stirring human images and self-portraits. He represented accurately the madness that was so characteristic of modern art and produced in his short life more than 300 paintings and 2,800 drawings. Egon Schiele reminds us constantly of what he thought of masculinity and his role within it, and ultimately what it means to be immortal. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the 1900s Vienna, and feel free to send any questions or comments you might have. See you in the next Pal House Art History lesson. Thank you.